And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this early Sunday evening here with me in New York as I drive. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So, for better or worse, and I mean this from an emotional perspective, I watched the Christopher Reeve documentary while I did my cardio this morning on Max, what used to be called HBO Max, and they took the HBO off of the front of it because reasons. And I knew it was going to be emotional. I was also very confident the film was going to be fantastic. Sometimes you look at reviews and you just know that the critical reception is not because they're trying to be nice or anything other than they made a really amazing movie. And so, for those who don't know, Christopher Reeve has been gone more than 20 years. To say that he died young is not really painting a very, accurate picture. It's not really painting any of the picture. Christopher Reeve was, at Juilliard, and in his younger days, he and Robin Williams were best friends. They kind of came up through the ranks together, and they both hit stardom at almost the same time. Now, Robin was a stand-up comic, and he was so insane on stage that he ended up making it big on TV. Like, his act, you wouldn't automatically have expected that it would translate to television, but somehow it did. And in the case of Christopher Reeve, he was this young theater actor who wasn't entirely comfortable on screen, in theater, on TV. He never exactly felt like he was made for one or the other or the other. He was just somebody who, he really loved the craft of acting. And it's hard to know if he ever imagined becoming one of the biggest stars in the world as a result of one particular role. But this documentary shows him on the rise, and you meet other people who ended up having huge careers from humble beginnings of off-Broadway theater, such as Jeff Daniels, who tells some pretty funny stories. And unfortunately, two of the other important people from his early days who he worked with, who he was friends with, who he trusted, who loved him, William Hurt is the other one who has since passed. And I didn't know that William Hurt and Jeff Daniels and Christopher Reeve worked in an off-Broadway production together in the middle 70s as Christopher Reeve was given the audition of a lifetime, and he was going to have to take some time away from this production because he was screen testing at Pinewood Studios in London. But Christopher Reeve's life is about and means a lot more than that of just an actor, a young actor who was on the business end of what I believe is the single greatest bit of casting in at least the last 50 years in Hollywood. And that was Warner Brothers, and they get into this in the documentary, whether it's Richard Donner or whether it's Pierre Spengler or any of the other people involved in the production of Superman. The Salkind family didn't take part in this documentary. I don't even know if they were asked. But the original iteration, what they were trying to do, and it's difficult, again, I hate to be the old head, but it's difficult for younger fans, let's say under the age of, certainly under 35, maybe even under 40, to imagine a Hollywood landscape in which making a large-scale, big-budget comic book movie was thought to be a joke, pathetic, and you're just going to lose money because nobody is going to go to a movie, watch a guy with his underwear on the outside of his costume, if you're going to be comic book appropriate. And it's funny, we can laugh, but that was the perception. So Hollywood wanted to cast a big star as Kal-El Clark Kent. And the biggest name who they targeted was Robert Redford, who was already a little bit old for it. He was around, late 30s, maybe he was almost 40. But Redford, at least, I hate to say this too, he had the kind of all-American look. Very, very attractive man, the hair, the big smile. You can almost picture the Redford of the 60s, the Barefoot in the Park era, maybe. But he was already too much of a brand name himself. He already had established, he had an eye for conservation and independent filmmaking, and he was not a normal movie star kind of a movie star. He just always, Redford's, he had different, very eclectic tastes, and he wanted too much money. Now, I don't think that he simply wanted too much money. I think he deliberately priced himself out because he didn't want to do it. He probably thought it was career poison, but he also didn't want to be insulting. Now, Redford was very, very canny, and his buddy, Warren Beatty, was another guy who always had an eye on this stuff. He didn't like to burn bridges. But when Redford turned it down, and James Caan, there's a version of The Matrix where James Caan played Superman, and when I tell you it would be 2 hours of screaming terror and hysterically funny, yeah, I want to see that. I want to see, go back to 1977, and we're going to make Superman with James Caan. I'm just laughing thinking about it. But Eastwood turned it down. Beatty turned it down. And then the producers, and Pierre Spengler, I guess you could say, almost stands in for the Salkins, who were the driving forces behind this. And they, history doesn't necessarily remember them that well because they fired Richard Donner, which is an absolute disgrace and disgusting, the amount of work. And Donner, in archived interviews, unfortunately he has passed as well, he talks about it. But Spengler says, our original plan was very, very straightforward. We were going to go with a big actor to kind of justify the studio's significant expenditure of money. And when that didn't work out, we still had a line, and especially, he doesn't mention this, but Mario Puzo wrote the original story/screenplay. Puzo didn't know how to write a screenplay, but he got a shit ton of money just the same. But they knew that they had a method and a mechanism where they were going to be able to get Brando to play Jor-El. And even though Brando, as Christopher Reeve he was almost not even joking when he said, they said, what was it like working with Brando? He says, honestly, it really wasn't that great. Marlon more or less just picked up a paycheck. And the audience is laughing, but Reeve didn't appreciate the fact that Brando didn't really give a shit. He seemed to not care. And yeah, he was using the method. He didn't want to memorize his lines because he wanted it to be natural. But nobody knew any of that. Knowing they could get Brando as Jor-El opened doors, and they changed their entire concept. Okay, I think we can get Gene Hackman for Luther, which would be a masterstroke. Gene had already won a Best Actor Oscar for The French Connection, many years earlier, 5-6 years earlier than what we're talking about here when this is in the casting stages. And we will get Valerie Perrine, and we can get Ned Beatty, and they're going over all of these possibilities, and they say, all right, we're going to get an unknown to play Kal-El. And Christopher Reeve, who looked like the way the character was drawn in the comics. That is something that can't be overstated. It is so preposterous beyond, it's beyond anything. It can't be, but that's exactly what it was. He was the right age, the right height. He had the ridiculous genetics where you say, this can't be right. You can't look like this guy. He was real. Yeah, you really could. Christopher Reeve, the most perfect hair of all time. The most perfect natural build. And then when he started working out, accentuated it even more. You see the young guy, David Corenswet, that they're talking about, and people are excited for what he's able to do in James Gunn's new one. But it's the fact that Christopher Reeve, once he started weight training, he looked like a guy who'd been lifting his whole life. Guy was built like a fucking tank. So he looked the part from the comics, and he had the line readings, because a lot of Superman's line readings, and it was Tom Mankiewicz, Puzo and some other people got credit for the script, and the joke on the audio commentary for the DVD, which I got many years ago, is that I didn't understand. Richard Donner kept making fun. He kept joking with Tom Mankiewicz, kept calling him the creative consultant, and they're laughing and giggling, and I didn't understand what the fuck they called him the creative consultant. He wrote the fucking script. There's barely anything. There's a couple of elements of Puzo's, but I guess it was in Puzo's contract that if he got story credit, they were going to make believe, more or less, that he wrote the screenplay. But there are lines of dialogue in Superman 1978, if delivered by a Robert Redford. Heaven forbid. May he rest in peace. I love James Caan. But some of these lines, for truth, justice, the American way. Who are you? A friend. No. but the earnest line delivery of Christopher Reeve, the look in his eyes, he sold it. And it's not an insignificant thing that he's reading dialogue that is ridiculous, but he's making it sing because he is so believable. He feels like Superman. He feels like Clark Kent. This is a guy who he has to pretend to be this bumbling imbecile who is a good reporter, and even as a kid, I understood that there was a certain level of artifice that Clark Kent, he's not really a bumbling doofus. He's pretending to be a bumbling doofus because he's trying to fit in. He kind of walks in a hunched over way. Christopher Reeve was about 6'4". Clark Kent looks like he's maybe 6'1.5". All of this was Reeve's performance, the ingeniousness. And look, I love Henry Cavill. Terrific actor. He certainly looked the part too. But there was less delineation between Clark Kent and Superman. It just felt like he was the same guy. And it doesn't work in the way that it did. And for all of the people who were predicting box office doom, bear in mind, the run-up to this film's release right around, it may have even been released Christmas Eve or Christmas Day of 1978. In all of this, nowadays we would have, as with the James Gunn Superman Reborn or whatever they're calling it, they're already buzzing, the movie's not good, the trailer sends out mixed signals, you got all this sort of stuff. There were just a lot of prognosticators in Hollywood predicting doom for Superman 1978. But when the movie landed, when it was getting some early premieres and the buzz, snail pace that people would get this kind of information, but the buzz was, hey, wait a second, this movie is good. They did not just throw their money away, and this kid is fantastic. Where the hell did they find him? Yeah, well, he was a New York theater actor and ending up in London, and the joke was between Jeff Daniels and William Hurt, more so William Hurt, he thought that it was a mistake for Reeve. He's like, you don't sell out. This is going to be a disaster. They're worried about, William Hurt thinks it's going to ruin his career. And supposedly Christopher Reeve even said to William Hurt, this is in Jeff Daniels recounting, and he's cracking up. He said, Chris even goes to William Hurt. He goes, Bill, they got Brando to play my dad. No, that doesn't matter. And it's just hilarious. Jeff Daniels is laughing as he tells this story. But when the film opened, the critical reception was very strong, and many of the critics were almost in shock that the film worked as well as it did, and they all were saying the same thing. This guy made you believe. The effects work for the day, fantastic, and he really made you believe that he was Superman. So one thing that a lot of people don't know is that most of Superman 1 and 2 were shot at the same time, similar to 20-some years later, almost a quarter century later, when Peter Jackson, because he had all the locations and he had the cast and everything, they shot Lord of the Rings, 3 movies, but they shot it essentially, it was one continuous shoot. They shot the 3 films in the immortal words of John Sterling, back to back to back, and a belly to belly to belly. So Superman 2 was almost completed when Richard Donner got fired by the Salkins. And it still doesn't make any sense that they were so short-sighted that they canned him, but they did. And they brought in a very talented filmmaker in his own right, Richard Lester, who had worked with the Beatles, the incredible documentary A Hard Day's Night about that tour, which I think was in 1964. And that's one of this kind of seminal documentaries. There are people that would have it in the top 10 best docus of all time. So he was not untalented, and a lot of people object to the fact that there are significant tone shifts in Superman 2 that there really aren't in Superman 1. Doesn't matter. I think Superman 2 is fantastic. I've seen the so-called Richard Donner cut. I actually, sacrilegious as it may be, I prefer Lester's version. The tone shifts, the kind of jarring nature of the way it moves back between almost screwball farce, and this is very serious Armageddon level stuff. It all works for me. And Superman 2 is still in my top 5 favorite comic book movies, along with Spider-Man No Way Home, Avengers Endgame, films of that caliber. So Christopher Reeve was, for a time, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, and he didn't want to be typecast as Superman, but it's just the nature of how these things go, that he kind of was because the success of the first film, which made between $450 and $500 million worldwide box office, that is bonkers. For the late 70s, it can't happen, and it happened. So Reeve did a number of very interesting films in the 80s, one of which, a very well-remembered romance with Jane Seymour, Somewhere in Time. It's kind of a culty film. It's a little bit goofy and silly. It's over the top. There's a time travel element, seemingly, and Fantasia and all this sort of stuff. But it's a very good movie. And Chris, as he was known to his friends, he showed that he could play a believable romantic lead. And he and Jane Seymour, they looked so good together. I don't even want to make jokes about two really attractive people, but that's two really not normal human being looking people in Jane Seymour and Christopher Reeve. So he did Superman 3. I see what they were going for. Richard Pryor is in it. It has its moments. Robert Vaughn makes a kind of dastardly villain. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And then Superman 4 is disastrously bad. The Salkinds they actually did a smart thing in punting the franchise. And Golan Globus with Cannon Group, they made some decent movies. They worked with Stallone on films like Over the Top. It's not that Menahem Golan didn't know what he was doing, but they projected the budget to be way higher than the amount of money they had, and it shows in the special effects. The story for Superman 4 is not terrible, but the film sucks. And if you look at Reeve's other work in the 80s, switching channels with Burt Reynolds and Kathleen Turner, it's just okay. It's a movie that HBO used to run constantly. I must have watched it 10 times. It's okay. Reeve is funny. He's the best thing about the movie. He steals the film from the nominal stars in Burt Reynolds and the really great Kathleen Turner. The most interesting movie, though, the most interesting other movie he made in the decade of the 80s is a film called Street Smart, where Reeve plays a young reporter. It's not the Washington Post, but it's supposed to be a newspaper of that caliber, New York Times, Los Angeles Times. And he fabricates a story, whole cloth, about like a killer pimp. I'm being serious. And he makes up this story in the hopes of maybe winning a Pulitzer Prize. But it turns out the story that he made up is 90+% true. That there is actually a pimp that has done what he wrote and is writing about, which is, again, that's a stretch, but in the world of the movie, it's believable, and the pimp is played by Morgan Freeman in the kind of performance that shows, how did Morgan Freeman become Morgan Freeman? Watch the movie Street Smart. Christopher Reeve is the lead, and Morgan rips the movie right out from under him. He is just dynamic and scary as fuck in a role that it's tough to expect if you know him as, Boyd Redding or Red in Shawshank. Holy crap, is he terrifying in Street Smart. The only other great performance that Reeve ever gave in a movie, in my opinion, was 1993's The Remains of the Day. And it's unfortunate he didn't get a Best Supporting Actor nomination, but that was the year where, DiCaprio in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and John Malkovich, who should have won, in The Line of Fire, and Tommy Lee Jones in The Fugitive, and Pete Postlethwaite in The Name of the Father. It was just an unbelievable year, and Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List. There's sadly no room for Christopher Reeve, who fucking crushes it. And every moment he's on screen in Remains of the Day, he is riveting. He almost makes you forget, oh, wait a minute, this is Anthony Hopkins' movie. Oh, look, it's Superman. No, he's incredible in Remains of the Day. And in one of the most cruel ironies, Christopher Reeve's last film that he shot before his terrible accident, which confined him and made him a quadriplegic for the rest of his life, sadly the last 9 years of his life, was a movie called Above Suspicion, which was a pretty good made-for-HBO thriller, co-starring another guy who was like a cheat code, Joe Mantegna. There's never been a Joe Mantegna movie or performance where you didn't say, wow, I love this guy. Whether it was playing the father in Searching for Bobby Fischer, which was just before that. But in Above Suspicion, Joe Mantegna and Christopher Reeve, it's kind of an unusual telling of a story. I think they're supposed to be Boston cops who don't really like each other, even though they're working on the same team. And there's a bit of a rivalry, like who's the best cop in Boston. It's a little silly. But Reeve's character takes a terrible injury in the world of the film, and he becomes a paraplegic. And whether or not he really is a paraplegic is a big part of the story. And I remember before seeing the film, HBO had like a 5 or 6 minute featurette talking about Superman playing a guy in a wheelchair and what was it like. And I'm just watching a little featurette about a movie, and I'm not really going deep, but he gave some really interesting answers about the research that he did and how difficult it was to try to just act with his body and sometimes his upper body, in other words, and it was very, very difficult and very humbling. And I felt like he said all the right things. And then not long after that, he had the horse steeple riding accident, which confined him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And he was a quadriplegic, and sadly, he never even got off a ventilator. He was able to take short puffing breaths, but he was never able to be completely weaned off of the ventilator. The muscles had atrophied to such an extent that there were certain muscles, and they talk about this in the documentary, where in some people with this debilitating, comprehensively destructive, debilitating condition, that their muscles rebuild to the point where they are able to come off the vent. Reeve was never able to. And he almost died in that accident. And that's something that I remember when it happened. And, circa 1995, it was right around Memorial Day weekend. It was touch and go whether he was even going to survive. And you think about a man, 42 is all he was at the time. The picture of health, didn't drink, didn't smoke. He was so active. The guy, when he wasn't working in movies and some of the TV work that he did, he was playing sports, he was swimming, he was doing so many physical things. And this fall, he landed in such a way that it was only 50-50 he was going to pull through. And the son, one of the sons, Matthew, not the one that you've seen on TV, Will Reeve, who works for ABC, Strahan had worked with him, Good Morning America. The other son, though, Matthew, talks about, because Matthew was old enough to remember this, I guess he was around 8, maybe 9 at the time, that they told him in later years that where his father had landed in this accident, if he landed 1/8 of an inch to the left, he would have been killed instantly. If he had landed 1/8 of an inch to the right, he would have maybe had a sore neck and he would have gotten right up, and it would have been a funny story to tell and a bit of an embarrassing story that he could have got thrown from a horse in that manner. But he just happened to land in the spot that was going to immobilize him for the rest of his life. There's just nothing you can even say about it other than the cruel twist of fate that there's really nothing. And no matter how many times you go over it, and in the documentary you watch the two sons and the daughter Alexandra, you watch them talk about it, and it's just devastating. It's devastating. Now, Will Reeve was about 2 years old, maybe. I think he was about to celebrate his 3rd birthday. So his memories are different because he was so small. But it is so gutting. And this is a very Captain Obvious kind of a moment. They're 3 really good-looking people. Will, you can see why he's on TV. He doesn't exactly look like Christopher Reeve, but you can see the genes. Like, the shape of the face is very similar. And the son and the daughter they're both so attractive. They're great people. They've done so much charitable work. And the thing, what Christopher Reeve did when he realized he wasn't going to die, and his second wife, who was Dana, she died only 1.5 years after him. The levels of tragedy that those 3 kids had to absorb, and the first 2 children, I should point out that Alexandra and Matthew were the product of Reeve's first marriage to Gay Exton, who he had met while he was making the original Superman. But as Will says, we're half siblings, but there's no half. We are just siblings. And they picked up the charitable work. So when he realized, I was saying that he was not going to die, and he had to figure out, how do I live? I'll never be able to be alone again in my life. I will need 24/7 constant care. I could die from a bed sore at any moment. It's just so horrifying to contemplate, but this became his life. And as much as he fought to want to walk again and to get back, if it was possible, of any semblance of a normal life, he dedicated himself to the cause of spinal cord research. And there are a lot of cliches anytime you enter any political scenario. But Christopher Reeve was not really a politics type of a guy. He met with everyone. There are images of him in the 80s with Ronald Reagan. There are images of him with the first President Bush in the early 90s. And then after his his accident with Bill Clinton, he didn't see himself as a partisan actor. He saw himself just as a tireless advocate for, well, what we now know as stem cell research. I don't know if it was called that in 1995-96 when he first started his advocacy. I don't know. But he ended up raising, because of his name and the tireless work of his second wife, Dana, that would be Will's mom, who she died of lung cancer. She never smoked and she died of lung cancer. You start saying, how are these things? How is this real? Yeah, it all happened. It wasn't supposed to be a tragic love story between the two of them, but sadly, that's how it looks now. That's how history makes it seem. But his tireless advocacy, they raised so much money. And as a few people in the documentary mentioned, there are people walking now because of the research that they were able to do because the funding came through, because so many people were so generous. And yes, I understand if someone is a billionaire and they give 10 million to a cause, it's not the same as the average person, let's say, giving even $1,000 in some cases, or 10,000, whatever number you want to say, but you still have to do it. And I'm not going to rag on anybody who has so much money. Well, they could have given twice as much. No, you give what you give, and it was all appreciated. And so many advances were made that also, in an unfortunate sense, if his accident had happened a decade later, he probably would still be alive. It is just, the thing is also, he went back to work while all this was going on. He directed an HBO film with Glenn Close called In the Gloaming. And he made the movie, the Brooke Ellison story about a fellow quadriplegic who ended up graduating from Harvard. It's absolutely impossible to imagine, but it all happened, and the documentary shows every piece of it. The good, the bad, and the true horror of what his life, unfortunately, entailed and how difficult it was. And the last thing I want to say is the documentary gets 4 stars out of 4 for me. It's 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. That is not a padded score. That is a real score. I remember live watching the 1996 Academy Awards. Those were the first Oscars after his accident. And nobody knew that he was going to be there. It was actually a secret that was kept, that he was going to make an appearance, because it was almost impossible to transport him that far. Any moment, if there's an issue with a respirator, he could have died. Again, not the kind of thing that you would think about back then. But when he appeared on stage, even though he only was there to say, hey, I'm still alive. Yes, I'm in a wheelchair. Yes, I'm probably always going to be in a wheelchair. It was such a humbling moment for the rest of Hollywood, with all the glitz, with all the glamour, and all of the accolades of all the glad handing of people in Hollywood, because it is a big night to pat yourself on the back. There's nothing wrong with that. They all work hard. It's different kind of work. They're all busting their asses. But seeing him up there and watching the different kinds of people in attendance trying not to bawl their eyes out, from Nicolas Cage, Quentin Tarantino, Brad Pitt, on down, it is still a simultaneously inspiring and soul-crushing moment. You could see it on YouTube if you don't have time to watch the documentary. But it is a great film, and it has left me not with a lot of questions, but a lot of hope that maybe someday it will be possible to, I don't see how you could ever cure a spinal cord injury, but the advances that have been made since his injury are extraordinary in their own right. Superman, the Christopher Reeve story, a documentary produced by DC Studios under James Gunn's stewardship. Although he had nothing personally to do with the film, he did give it his seal of approval when he saw an early cut. But it is now streaming on Max, and if you know a lot about him, it's worth seeing. And if he's just a name, if you just know, oh, that's the guy that used to play Superman before Henry Cavill, you must see this film. It will leave you shaken to the core, but also with a sense of hope. This has been episode 377 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. Sorry, I got a little emotional, but I want to thank you for spending some of your early Sunday evening with me here in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.